It's the best fun. That's what you learn in the world of writing a script, story structure. It's the hardest thing for every writer. The easy thing is characters and dialogue. We can all do those to various degrees, but story structure is hard and you have to learn it. And that's why it's good to do script writing, because you get your editors and your producers and everyone basically working with you and beating the hell out of you to don't get it right, to get the product into the shape where it's filmable. My editor calls it breadcrumbs. I call it laying pipe, which is what we call it in the script writing world. You're laying pipe that out of which eventually comes the solution. All writing is set up and payoff. All story structure, all plot structure, as I prefer to call it, set up and payoff. And interestingly, one of the things I've learned, having been able to get 4 books written before one was published, one was proofread and finished, I was able to keep going back into book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, lay pipe, put the breadcrumbs in, set things up that pay off in not just later in the story, but in the next story or the story after that. So that's been great fun to do. Part of the thing that I really enjoy most about writing fiction, which, as I said, I've come to late, and I really, really always wanted to write fiction. So pleased to have found this world. One of the joys of writing fiction is that you get stuck. You get completely confused. It's just you and the reader. And you can't go to your editor and say, what do I do? Because they don't know what you're doing. You haven't written an outline. I mean, I write my outlines as I go along. So I'm flying by the seat of the pants on one hand. On the other hand, I'm backing off and saying, okay, so here's the outline and where, feeding back and forth. But it's when you get lost, you go, okay, don't, in the words of my old friend Douglas Adams, don't panic.
Everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have a great author on with me today. If you're seeing the video, you're seeing a beautiful fireplace behind my guest, a bookshelf overflowing with great books, and a great author here on the podcast. It's exciting to have Richard Sparks on the podcast today to talk about his journey. We're going to learn a lot, and we're going to have a great conversation. Richard, welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
It's exciting to have you here. Now, when we hear your marvelous accent, automatically we travel to a part of the world where you're not right now. Tell us where you are currently.
Well, I live in Los Angeles now. I'm an American citizen as well as being English. And I just kept the British accent. I thought I'd get the best of both worlds.
With it, yeah.
Which is kind of fun because I do the audio book of New Rock, New Roll. And in it, there are various different characters. There's a British narrator and some sort of British comedy characters in there.
I love it.
In a quasi-historical manner. But there's also an Asian American girl. And I don't have her accent particularly well. It's okay. There's an Australian orc. I've got him. I can do the Australian, no bloody trouble, mate. Yeah. But the West Coast California where I live is a little sketchy, but people have been kind enough to forgive me.
There you go. Well, you're bringing all the class to our American friends there. So thank you for representing well. And it's great to have you here. You have a long history in writing for, when I read through your bio and stuff, Richard, you've written for some pretty outstanding people in your past. I would love to can we touch on that a little bit? Because there's some names that popped off the screen to me that I'm like, people that you've worked with or written for, and they've been in your world. Can you talk a little bit some of the people you've had the pleasure of working with in the past?
It's been a great pleasure to cross paths with so many great talents and great names. And the one thing they all have in common is how incredibly hard they all work. The talent is the least of it. There's a great line in the Hustler, the original, the Paul Newman, when he's begging Minnesota Fats to play with him. And he says, look, I've got talent. I've really got talent. And the old guy says, listen, kid, everyone's got talent. It's such a great line. And it's really important for people to learn because everyone's got talent. Yeah. And it's everything else that makes that talent turn from potential into fruition and achievement. And for example, I worked with Rowan Atkinson before he was, I think he was just left university. And we wrote a show together. Richard Curtis and Rowan were a writing team. And I worked with the other actor in the show, Peter Wilson. I was a writing team with him. So I actually wrote a sketch for Rowan that John Cleese saw, and John Cleese asked him to be in the Secret Policeman's Ball, as it was later called. Rowan called me up a year after the show and said, John Cleese just rang, and can I do the Schoolmaster sketch? And I said, of course you can. And so he did it, and he really went on stage an unknown and came off a star. And it's just lovely to have been to have just crossed paths with something that good. Because we all knew Rowan was brilliant and was going to go on to great things. And so just that my little sketch, which would be sitting in the bottom drawer, with all the other 40-year-old jokes, if it hadn't been the fact that I gave it to Rowan rather than to Peter, my writing partner. I thought I've got to write something for the new guy. I can't just write for my friend.
Yeah.
So I wrote that, gave it to Rowan, and I saw him do it like 20 or 30 times in the little show at Hampstead Theatre. And so I knew how well he did it. He just owned the room.
Horrid little twat. Bland German Nancy Boy Potter under manager cribbing. Under manager answer upside down. You do it deliberately under manager. You're a moron under manager, what are you? A carbuncle on the backside of humanity. Don't snigger, Babcock. It's not that funny. Antony and Cleopatra is not a funny play. If Shakespeare had meant it to be funny, he would have put a joke in it.
So I knew what was going to hit these people, an audience full of 3,000 people. And he just ate them alive. It was just great fun, just to be sitting there and going, told you. And then, of course, he was off to the races.
Yeah.
I actually drove Humphrey Barclay, who was head of London Weekend Television, head of light entertainment. I drove him from London down to Oxford to see Rowan in a post-student review. I said, you've got to see this guy.
Yeah.
And Humphrey didn't want to go. I was just a nobody. He just vaguely knew me through my agent. Said, oh, all right. I said, look, he's the real thing. He's the next Peter Sellers.
Yeah.
And actually, I think he's had a more remarkable career than Peter Sellers in many ways, if you look at his achievements, like Blackadder and Mr. Bean.
Yeah.
And Humphrey, he was sitting forward at the front of the dress circle next to me, and he just got up and ran backstage to be the first one there. I had to go after him and introduce him to Rowan. I don't think they ever worked together, but that's how good he was. Yeah. And so for me to just have kind of, as it were, riding his coattails. The fact that I wrote the script and then he took it. It's supposed to be the other way around. He rode my script tails. But it's just lovely to work with people that good and then to go on and see them flourish.
Yeah.
For example, Danielle Denise, the great opera singer who's now a world star. I auditioned her when she was 14, a week before her 15th birthday, for the Los Angeles Opera, with my composer Lee Holdridge, who'd been commissioned to write a 1-hour opera for the LA Opera's Hispanics program. And we needed a teenage girl with an immature voice, not an adult voice.
Yeah.
And Danielle came in and sang and just blew me away. I'm not qualified to judge, but I thought she was incredible. I turned to Lee after she and her mother, Beverly, had left. And I said, oh, that was pretty good, wasn't it? And he said, We've got our lead singer. It's amazing. And then a year later, she opened and it just owned it. And all the kids who were part of the school's program who would go to see it, saying, "Oh God, opera's cool if someone like this is doing it."
Yeah,
and she's great. And she's gone on to be a world star. Still a great friend. I'm trying to think of anyone else I've been involved with at an early stage, but I've come across people, I work with people who were already at the top of their career, and who sort of, you're part of them, and it's great to work with Placido Domingo and Eric Idle, and just even if you're only in the same room as them for half an hour and they're doing your material, or in the case of Domingo, he was conducting an opera that I wrote and directed.
Wow.
At the Los Angeles Opera, from a short story by Isabel Allende, who's sold 60 million books or more, and she's a great hero of mine. I admire her work very much. It was my choice to use her short story as the basis for the full-length opera, and the fact that she liked it at the end was really the thing that mattered to me most. Well, so if you live long enough and you're in this business, you bump into people who are either names or going to be names.
Yeah.
And some of them are just fantastic mentors. I've tried to mentor young people in the last few years. Zoom has been very useful for this. I can work with actors doing a scene, for example, and one's in a room in London and others in a room in some other continent, and I'm here and I can help work with them through the scene. But I've had mentors who've given me such great black belt insights into the business in various forms that you can't buy those anywhere else except by working with the really good ones.
Mm. So when you hear like Rowan up on stage reading what words that you have penned, do you hear yourself or do you hear Rowan in that moment?
Oh, it's his performance.
Yeah.
They're my words.
Yeah.
What you don't want is people to look through the actor. You want them to see it in the moment and to see him doing a Schoolmaster. They don't want to think who wrote this. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's quite a funny story about this because Rowan was already famous by the time this happened. I was in my local pub in London where I'd gone with Times crossword to sit there and have a couple of pints after a day's work. And 3 people came and sat at the table next to me and said, "Can we sit here?" There's a girl and 2 more boys probably in their 30s. I said, "Of course." So we sat down and I was doing my crossword and one of them quoted a line from the Schoolmaster sketch. So I just looked, I went, "Oh!" And they sort of looked at me and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've never heard myself quoted in public before. I wrote that." And the girl said, "No, you didn't." I said, "What?" She said, "No, you didn't. Richard Curtis wrote it. He's a friend of mine." But that's just very awkward. I said, "Well, look, I've got the manuscript around the corner in my house, and Richard wrote everything else with Rowan because they're a partnership, but I wrote that." "No, you didn't." She just simply wouldn't listen. She knew. It's amazing when people know things and they close their minds to any other possibility. Mm-hmm. And of course, the reason that she would have said that was in Rowan's one-man or two-man show that he did. He had to do the Schoolmaster because it had launched him. It was his party piece, and so it was the closing act. It was his encore number, and he'd come in, and every time he came on stage in the gown and the clipboard, the audience would roar. And it was just great. And the show said, quite rightly, written by Rowan Atkinson and Richard Curtis, additional material by Richard Sparks, because I didn't write their show. I just wrote that one sketch, and that's the convention in show business. Yeah. Now, if you're in the audience, you don't think that let's boast. You don't think that the best thing in it is additional material.
Yeah.
You just don't think like that.
No.
But it was. So she was quite justified in making the assumption that it was part of the show, but. I've got a friend of mine who's a producer had an even better one than that when he was sneaking off to have a date with somebody he was interested in, like 100 miles from London. And someone in a pub was boasting about how he knew this guy. And they just sat there listening.
Yeah.
We had this conversation a few months ago in London in the very same pub where I'd had the Schoolmaster sketch shoved up me by this poor girl. And then he says, "Well, I got a better one than that." And he told the story. He said at the end, he stood up to the guy and said, "Excuse me, I'd just like to tell you that I'm so-and-so and you're talking complete bollocks." So it's funny how these things happen.
I love it. So for those that are a big fan of Rowan Atkinson and all of his work, any little insight that you can share with us about the man? I find him so fascinating. So his timing, him as a person, the voice, his persona, there's just something special about this gentleman. Is there any little insight you can give us about this man?
The gift is extraordinary. I haven't been in the same room as Rowan for decades. I mean, I live over here. He lives in the outside London. I mean, we'd still, if we ever saw each other, we'd love to see each other, but, be great friends. But I've gone one way, he's gone another, and I mean, all I see of him is his work, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But what I can share about him, well, he's very. This was in the old days, like 30 years ago, when he was a kid or a graduate student. Very sweet, very sort of didn't push himself forward, not like a sort of bouncy, full of himself actor type at all. And the funny thing was, he saw me and my friend Peter Wilson who sadly died recently. He was my scene partner. He was very funny. I wasn't, but I did the writing, so he used me as his straight man. And we did shows. We did one in my summer holidays at the Edinburgh Festival, and Rowan and his group from the Oxford Revue saw us do our two-man show before I saw him on stage. And afterwards, they came to support us, which was really nice of them.
Nice.
And so afterwards, we all met and said hello. I know Richard Curtis was there. Some of the other names I may have got wrong, so I won't mention them. But
yeah.
And someone said, "Oh, you've got to meet this guy." And he was standing at the back of the room, and I went to talk to him. And he actually said, I mean, it's kind of blushing to say, he said, "I don't know why people like us are bothering to do shows when you're doing, you two are doing things like this." And I thought, well, what a nice, modest young man, you know. And then we went to see the Oxford Revue a couple of nights later, and it was a perfectly good review, the student review, some good bits, some less good. And one bit, Rowan came on with a little bit of paper, sort of like this, torn. Tried to give it to the audience, and then didn't want to. So making face and going, blah, 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 doing Rowan stuff.
Yeah.
And Peter was here, and I was here. We just turned to each other at the same time. And went, just what the hell? Well, that's the real thing there.
Yeah.
That is extraordinary. And the audience kind of didn't know whether to laugh because it was so weird. But it was completely inhabited by this bizarre character on stage doing this bizarre thing.
Yeah.
It's just, wow. And poor Peter had to then do the show at Hampstead a couple of years later, the one that I wrote the Schoolmaster sketch for Rowan in, with Rowan and Peter's then wife at the time. And he said it was very lonely following Rowan on stage because he was such an extraordinary presence.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a scientist. I think he was doing a master's in electrical engineering or something at Oxford. So he wasn't an undergraduate. He went to Oxford just as Peter and I left and headed out into the world. And he didn't have anywhere to live. So I think it actually was Peter's wife, Ellie, talked to friends of hers. And they had a spare kind of granny flat or something. It wasn't being used. So they let Rowan use that. And I think maybe even Richard Curtis lived there with them for a bit. And Rowan couldn't afford the rent, couldn't have any money. So he rewired their house. I mean, I probably shouldn't tell you this because he wouldn't have had a license. But he said it's absolutely perfect. The bends were perfect.
Yeah.
No professional electrician would have spent nearly so much time getting it just so perfect like that. So that's what he done. He loves to drive his heavy goods vehicle trucks and stuff. I just hear about it from people, and I was. So yeah, I mean,
I love it.
I'm sure he's the same guy, much the same inside as he was, and it's been great to see what he's achieved since then.
It's amazing. So when I hear you talk about the people you've been able to write for and the variety of things that you've written, two words come to my mind. It is words matter. Just those two words. That as you write, as you come to your writing, that's so important that your words matter, and that your words then can be translated by others, can be used in different spaces, far beyond maybe what you thought in scope. But as a writer, for people that are listening that are on a journey of becoming a writer or growing as a writer, can you expound on those two words, that words matter? What does that spark for you?
Absolutely. Very, very simply. There's an old Hollywood story in this town, in Beverly Hills, a dinner party with the great and the good and the elderly of Beverly Hills, a private dinner party in somebody's house. And one of the guests turned to the woman sitting next to him and said, excuse me, I'm very excited to hear. I hear that your husband wrote Old Man River. And she said, yes, he did. And another elderly lady at the end of the table said, excuse me, my husband wrote Old Man River. Her husband wrote da, 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 da. Words matter. Without the words, that's your starting point. People often ask about musicals and operas, of which I've written musicals we won't talk about. Anyway, but operas, I've written several. That's People say, what comes first, the words or the music? Well, obviously the words come first, because how else does the musician know what he's writing about? I have done I've added lyrics to songs that people sent me, one of which Domingo recorded. A composer called George Calandrelli sent it to me for his for Domingo's Christmas party that he does every year, or used to do every year, in Vienna. And so that was a tune with no words, so I put words to that. But usually it's the notion of the song is verbal. Without it, there's maybe a beautiful melody, a beautiful tune, and you can add music to add words to beautiful tunes, but it's not the right way to create a story. And every song is a story. Every opera is a story. Every musical is a story. So yeah, the words come first, and then what happens is that they become somebody else's property. For example, it's the Rowan Atkinson Schoolmaster sketch. The fact that I wrote it, you don't want the audience, bothering about that. It's this guy on stage being a schoolmaster. Chekhov said, I write one thing, the actors write another thing, together we make a play. Now, he doesn't mean that they change his words at all, but they create their own characters. I always stress this with actors. I say, well, acting is not interpretative. It's creative. Your job is to create the character. Mm-hmm. And if you take a great writer like Pinter, often what happens that's the most important in a speech or a section is what's between the end of the one sentence, the period at the end of one sentence, and the capital letter at the next. Mm-hmm. What is the journey between one sentence and the next?
Oh, I like that.
And they're often huge.
Yeah.
And the character thinks something through it. If you do to be or not to be in one breath, I mean, you're getting 10% of it. But if you take your time to think, the guy's thinking, well, to be or not to be, that's the question, Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble and by opposing end them. I'm doing it a little bit tongue in cheek, and then it's a thought process. Yeah. It's not you're not on rails. If an actor starts doing a speech and gets on rails, you have to haul them off and say, listen, take your time, go exploring.
Yeah. I see that in music. I love music, and I've been a musician for years. I see the beauty of music is what happens between the notes.
Yes.
Those gaps. That's where music lives and breathes, right?
Yeah. The gaps are important. I go and play, I play 5-string banjo. I've been playing for decades, but I'm still useless. But anyway, I go and play with a very good player here once a week, and he says, the gaps are really important. And in a banjo, which if you don't keep going, the notes disappear because the banjo has no sustain.
Yes.
But even on an instrument as clattery and as desperate as the banjo, with a guitar, you can leave it.
Yeah.
There's time, but you still need those pauses and the gaps, and they're very, very important.
It's amazing. So I would love to hear your thoughts around the connection between an author and a reader, or an author and someone sitting in to experience an opera, see someone on stage doing a monologue, reading to us, building that. What's that bridge between an author and a consumer of great content? How do we make that stronger? What solidifies that bridge between the two?
It's the magic. That's where the magic. It's the spark that jumps across the footlights from the actor into the audience. That's what gets you. When that's missing, the play can be good or mediocre, but when it's great, when you see a great Hamlet up there, I've seen probably 10 in my life. They're all different. And when you read a book that gets you, and you become a fan, and this is why we're longing for the sequel. I mean, I've got 4 already, 3 sequels, 1 book, so I'm ahead. But I'm dreading the time when people come up to me and say, "Where's the next one?" I say, "I'm still writing it." That must be really a scary situation to be in. I hope I don't find myself in that position, because people, when they invest in something, it's theirs. It's your book.
Yeah.
It's really important to make it personal, just as an actor should make his Hamlet personal. Every actor should bring himself to the part, or herself to the part, and the part to herself, making it personal. And when you get that connection between a writer and a reader, it's completed. Do you know who Stephen Fry is? You probably do.
Oh, yeah.
He's a very well-known writer as well as an actor. and a very good reader. And I wrote to him the other day, 'cause I know him, and I said, because I'd listened to him doing the stories of Sherlock Holmes. That's 60 hours of them. They're just glorious. And I wrote to him and said how much I enjoyed them. And he said, well, thank you. Sometimes you're sitting in the studio and it's just nice to know there's somebody out there, which is sweet.
Yeah.
Because you do the work for yourself. You do it to the best of your ability. You know, and I've read the audiobook of New Rock, New Roll. But when somebody comes back to you and says, reacts to it and talks about it, it's funny because this is the early stages of my career as a published author of fiction. It was only published a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And the difference in the interviews between people who've read the books and the people who've just heard about them and got the PR blurb and said, that sounds interesting and you've had an interesting career, let's talk. That's fine. That's great. That's good fun. But when they've read the books, the feedback is completely different. Mm. So they're into it. And you've got something in common to talk about that's not just, referencing famous actors or stars or whatever. So that's really exciting when you get that and you go, oh, it works for that person.
Yeah.
It's very heartening. But of course, your job as a writer is to write to the best of your ability and to cut out all the clutter around it and not even think about that. Mm. It's got to work for you. And that's where the skill of self-editing comes in, which we can talk about at some point if you like.
I would love
to. But it's the creative process and the editing process. But when you get the feedback, you go, oh, it's really, really very rewarding and moving. Especially people who said they laughed. I just laughed out loud. That bit made me laugh out loud. Didn't it?
I like it.
Really, because it's an adventure story, and adventures and comedy do fit naturally together when things go wrong. And characters are sort of ghastly and just, overweening and, snotty and all this. And there's no reason why fantasy shouldn't have comedy in it.
Nice.
But it's anyway, the feedback is really encouraging.
I love it. The joy of this podcast is connecting readers to their next favorite author, their next favorite book, their passion as a reader, to just immerse themselves in a world. Can you talk about your book and the other things you've been writing? Let's kind of introduce a reader to what you're up to, and let's build a bridge now with a listener and bring them into your world. Can you talk about your book a little bit more?
Yes, it's fantasy fiction. It's a field I've always loved, but for some reason I never thought of reading it. Never thought of writing it until the idea fell out of the sky and hit me on the head less than 5 years ago. I started writing that day. I finished the first book in 2 months, 160,000 words, just blew out of me. Couldn't believe my luck. The caveat is there's been a great deal of editing. I made, so much to learn in the process, so many steps I took that I was just relaxing and having fun. And by the time my agent got back to me and said, this is just what people want. It's escapism, it's fun, blah, blah, blah. Then I realized this is actually a commercial job now. Because I was writing the book, I just thought, let's go and have fun in a new world. Let's go and see what would happen. Let's wander about. 3 chapters cut out, get on with the story. Once it became real and someone wanted it, you go, well, I can't just fanny about doing this. We've got to get on with the story, because a book that doesn't make you turn the pages, well, it doesn't really interest me anymore. I need to be lured along by the writer. I always believe the writer should do all the work and the reader should have all the fun. Make it easy for them. Put them in an armchair, give them a good time, give them a ride. Yeah. So, of course, the basic idea, it came out of my love of role-playing games on the internet, massive multiplayer online role-playing games, which have been around for a couple of decades now. And I just thought one day, what would it actually be like to be this guy? My avatar was a heroic young battle mage, with a magic staff, and he galloped around with his friends, often in PvP, getting up to mischief and destroying monsters and having fun and doing whatever he did, and with people all over the world in my earphones doing what they, if it was a PvP multiplayer game as opposed to just person versus environment, one player. Anyway, the idea of just what would it be like to be this guy, and there was only one way to find out, and that was to write it. And of course, instantly, you think, well, if he goes from being mashing a keyboard to actually standing in a field with a crappy sword and shield, he's going to be completely useless. What would it really be like to be that guy? You wouldn't have a clue. Just because it looks good as an idea.
Yeah.
To be, oh, wouldn't it be nice to be a heroic battle mage doing this, that, and the other? Well, listen, chum, be careful what you wish for. The three of them, the narrator is basically someone like me, a middle-aged retired schoolmaster, who spends his life gaming online, and his two best friends are an Asian American girl sword dancer who lives in California. That's all he knows about her. And an Australian whose avatar is an orc. And the three of them are just unstoppable. They become world champions. And the next thing he knows, he's whisked off down a whirlpool of special effects and finds himself standing in a field where he's his own avatar, a, quote, heroic young battle mage, for real. And he's completely useless. So, of course, the first thing happens is everything gets worse. You know, he's chased by wolves and captured and sold off to be in the army. And, of course, when he's in the army, he trains up and gets good. And then he's got to find out if the others are in the world. There's no sign of them. He feels lost without them. And so he's got to survive in that world and learn what's happened. And it's all explained, what's happened. It's his own avatar for real. They all are. And then at the end of the book, we're set up for the further adventures. As I said, I've written 4 in the series so far, and I'm floundering about in the early stages of the 5th at the moment. And it's so interesting because you look back and it's, God, yeah, of course, that was so easy. Yeah. But you're looking forward. I remember in the middle of book 3, the moon is an important character in book 3. And I would just go out and it's another full moon and I still haven't cracked it. Help! And look up there. And then afterwards you go, oh, yeah, because you've got to work out the puzzles and the twists and the turns and the challenges that are facing our hero. And how's he going to fix them? And the race against time and all that sort of stuff. So now I'm in that same stage in book 5 going, yeah, this is the problem, but how on earth do we solve that? And keep on keeping on, keep on trying to... Well, I was on a panel recently at a convention with a writer called David Gerald, who's taught writing, I think at Pepperdine for many years, screenwriting, and he wrote the original Star Trek, some of those. Wow. The famous episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, is one of his. And on the panel, he said, look, story structure is very simple. See the problem, address the problem, solve the problem. It's a good way of looking at it. And at the moment, I've seen the problem, and I'm attempting to address it, and got vague ideas about the solution, but there's 400 pages of fun and chaos to be had before I get there.
I love when an author has fun in the writing process and kind of bakes in some interesting things that when they find out their reader is on chapter 2 and as an author in chapter 4, your world's going to get turned upside down, planting those seeds in the story that are going to generate growth and change something for the reader. How much fun is that for you as an author to kind of build those little nuggets in, knowing your reader is going to discover these at some point in the reading your book?
It's the best fun. Yeah. That's what you learn in the world of writing a script, story structure. It's the hardest thing for every writer. The easy thing is characters and dialogue. We can all do those to various degrees, but story structure is hard and you have to learn it. And that's why it's good to do script writing, because you get your editors and your producers and everyone basically working with you and beating the hell out of you to get it right, to get the product into the shape where it's filmable. My editor calls it breadcrumbs. I call it laying pipe, which is what we call it in the script writing world. You're laying pipe that out of which eventually comes the solution. All writing is set up and payoff. All story structure, all plot structure, as I prefer to call it, set up and payoff. And interestingly, one of the things I've learned, having been able to get 4 books written before one was published, one was proofread and finished, I was able to keep going back into book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, lay pipe, put the breadcrumbs in, set things up that pay off in not just later in the story, but in the next story or the story after that. So that's been great fun to do. Part of the thing that I really enjoy most about writing fiction, which, as I said, I've come to late, and I really, really always wanted to write fiction. So pleased to have found this world. One of the joys of writing fiction is that you get stuck. You get completely confused. It's just you and the reader.
Yeah.
And you can't go to your editor and say, what do I do? Because they don't know what you're doing. You haven't written an outline. I mean, I write my outlines as I go along. So I'm flying by the seat of the pants on one hand. On the other hand, I'm backing off and saying, okay, so here's the outline and where, feeding back and forth. But it's when you get lost, you go, okay, don't, in the words of my old friend Douglas Adams, don't panic. I knew Douglas since, before Hitchhiker. And so you just go, this is great. This is a real difficult, miserable, nasty problem. How the hell am I going to solve this? When you get that, you go, if you can pull this off, where it all makes sense at the end, then of course you have to keep going back and fixing things, going forward. If it's going to pay off, then I've got to change that line in, like riddles in poems, poetry form riddles. They're always great fun in games and in books. And you go back, okay, we've got to tweak that line in the riddle because that didn't work. But then, there's the answer. So it is a lot of fun and also extremely frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. You're kind of building your parachute as you jump out of the plane.
Yeah, that's very good. Yes, you're desperately sewing as you plummet to the earth. That's right. I'd love that. That's really good.
Okay, you talked about self-editing, and maybe we could come back to this. Maybe we should do that now. Can you give us your overview about self-editing as an author? Is there any kind of key points that we need to kind of consider as we go down our journey as an author? Talk more about self-editing.
Yeah. There are some bullet points, but if you say them boldly, like get out of your own way, it really doesn't sound too helpful. I think it might be an interesting way to approach this, to tell the story of my first major editing experience. It's a producer called James Gatwood. This was in London in the 70s. It was a series called The Famous Five, based on the children's books by Enid Blyton, which are massive world sellers. My agent said, James is one of the few producers who'll give an unknown writer a break. I had a few small credits on regional TV, but Jill was a respected author's agent, scriptwriter's agent. So James said, I'll give him a meeting. So I went along to meet him and talked about the series. And he said, okay, well, look, here, take this book. And this is one that's going to be 2 episodes, we think. So you've got to split it into 2. Go in and produce an outline. And I thought, okay, what the hell's an outline? So quite off the top of my head, I said, do you have a house style you'd like me to address? Or shall I just lay it out the way I normally do, or some bullshit like that? And he reached into his desk and he brought out a paperback of one of the stories, an outline, and the script that another writer had written, and handed me, said, here, do it like that. So I got my first look at an outline, a first look at a proper half-hour script laid out by a real writer and finished, and the book. So I went away and I read the book. So I read the outline that the other author had done. Oh, this is easy. Can do this. That's just reducing the book to story beats, really. And looked at the script and thought, I can do this, no problem. So I sent in the outline to James, and he says, oh, great, okay, go and write it. And then he'd call my agent and said, he'll have to take £300 less a script because he's unknown than the full rate. Yes. It was still a massive amount of money to be. I paid off my debts, all that sort of stuff. Paid the rent for 6 months. And then I go in with the script. This is the point of the story. I'm feeling quite chuffed because I thought I'd done a great job, and my immortal words were now about to be pronounced on television. And he opened the front page because it was they had those old cardboard covers with a hole cut out with the title. And the first page was a sea of blue ink. We had a big blue crayon, arrows, things crossed out, circled, linked to other bits, notes written up the side, other bits done. And I felt as if I'd been disemboweled. I felt absolutely sick. My God, what's he done to my immortal work? I knew enough to not show anything. And we went through it page by page by page, me feeling sicker and greener all the time. God, is this torture never going to end? And eventually got to the end of it, and I said, great, okay, well, thank you. I'll address those notes. went away, addressed the notes, did it really fast, sent him in to, a couple of days later, the rewritten script. He called me in for a script meeting, and we went through it, and there were like 3 notes in the entire 30 pages. And he gave me the rest of the series to write.
Wow.
The next one, I got £150 less instead of £350 less. But then after that, I was on the full whack, and I ended up doing the second series with Gail Renard, and Gail was later head of our Writers Guild in Great Britain twice. She was my writing partner on The Famous Five. We script edited each other's stuff. James didn't need to get involved. Said, "You two guys are so good, you do it." Script edit each other's. So we polished the scripts and sent them in, and the series was very, very highly rated. Did very well. And then when Not the 9 O'Clock News was starting, Portman Productions, James's company, he'd left by then to be head of Southern TV, but the head of the company, Tony Firth, hired me to go to New Zealand and write a 26-part TV series, half-hour children's adventure, family adventure, shot on film, on location in New Zealand. I was meant to write 8 scripts, and I ended up writing 23 because the writer down there didn't know how to write scripts. So I was basically locked in a room for months. I saw a little bit of New Zealand, but not as much as I'd have liked, because it's a gorgeous country, and the people are great. So that bought me a house. Well, plus mortgage, but, bought me a house at age 28 in London. That was phenomenal. So basically, when I say get out of your own way and do as you're told, take your notes, deliver what people want, I hope my own experience might make chime with you, because you do feel your work is precious to start with. Yeah. You do feel that you've written something that is you wouldn't have written it otherwise, would you? Yeah. But then you look at it from a point of view of an actor. If a producer says to me, "Yeah, I read your script, I didn't like it," okay, that's fine. That's just some words. By then you've grown a thick skin, so all right, it's not for you. Go for someone else. An actor, "I saw your audition. I didn't like you." The whole person they didn't like. That's brutal. Yeah. Me, it's just some words I put on paper. It's still personal, still matters. I still do the best work you can. But for an actor, and actors have to be so sensitive to the material, and yet have a hide like a rhinoceros to the business. It's totally schizophrenic, and it must drive them up. I'd hate to be an actor, but I've never had the talent of someone like a Daniel Denise or a Rowan Atkinson. So what would I know? Yeah, I never wanted to do it. But there's only one reason for being an actor, which is if you really, 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 really have to be. Yeah.
Is there a point where it's too early to be self-editing? Should you wait a little bit in your process of writing? What works for you?
Well, you always got to look at it and think, can you do that better? If you write a paragraph, you write an email, you reread it and tchotchke with it, don't you? Often. I mean, there are so many stories of scripts being rewritten 30 times, and then they go back and shoot the first draft in this town. Probably some of those stories are true. I think it's very, very important to be able to stand outside your own work. This is the advantage. I was lucky enough to go to Oxford University, and I studied English, which means you just do English language and literature. So you read all the great works, and that's basically exposure to the culture of the human race, going back to the classics. It's everything that humans have thought and done in every form, poems, prose, stage, everything. These aren't just books. This is our culture. And you learn how to read deeply. It's quite a skill. It doesn't come naturally, but you learn to look beyond the words. What is the meaning? It says this, but what does it mean? And you learn to read deeper and deeper and deeper. And eventually you can apply that skill to your own work. And you can go, you can then evaluate the quality of what you've written much more, let me say, how would it be? Not much more impersonally, as if you're evaluating someone else's work. And that's one of the skills of self-editing, is you've got to be able to full focus, stand on the hilltop and look down at the entire forest. What have we got here? Instead of floundering about in through the trees, pressed up against the bark, unable, where am I going? Here, in the throes of creativity, which is great fun. Yeah. Get back and say, all right, what's really going on here? And if that's happening, then that needs to happen, and to be quite cold-blooded about it. And that really, really helps. I was astonished when I came to Los Angeles and learned that in the old days, producers would talk about the writer writes the scenario, and then you add the dialogue. Because I came from a more verbal, I'd written some plays as well as scripts and radio and stuff, sketches, which is all words. That's all you've got in a play is the words, the dialogue. And to think of writing the scenario and adding the dialogue last, that really sent me, knocked me over. And I thought, that's a very strange way to write. I don't do that myself. There are writers who are really good at outline and then go from outline to story. I was listening to P.G. Wodehouse, a story that was written 101 years ago, because I listened to it last year. It's fresh as the day it was born. And he talks in the introduction to that about how he loves writing his books, but he doesn't like planning them. And he'll sometimes get through 450 pages of notes before he starts on the story. And you go, what? I mean, the great comic master of the 20th century, who turned out all these amazing stories and has this just an incredible style. And he does 450 pages of notes before starting to write. You go, ye gods! So that's how the good ones do it.
Yeah,
because who doesn't admire Wodehouse?
Right. The one question I would love to ask and get your thoughts on for New Rock and New Roll, your main character, you're able to sit down and have a conversation face to face with your main character. There's got to be questions that you don't know the answer to about your main character. That would be fascinating for you as an author to sit down with your main character and speak to them. If you could do that, what is one of the questions that you would love to ask your main character that you don't know the answer to?
Whoa, that's pretty tricky, because in the case of New Rock, New Roll, R-O-L-E, it came out of my love of role-playing games. As I said, it kind of is me. I mean, he's a middle-aged dude playing games who suddenly finds himself in a new world for real, in a new body, and he's young again. I mean, I might say, what's it like to be young again? But otherwise, I know him, but the other two, my teammates, who I've known all the last few years since we've been playing games together and running together and winning world championships together, I know nothing about them in real life. All I know is one's an Australian and the other's an Asian American, or an American girl, and her avatar's Asian American looking, so he assumes that's what she is in real life. But he doesn't know, and they don't talk about it. Because there is an unwritten rule in role-playing games, is that you don't pry. And this is one of the nice things about them, which actually bleeds into the book, in that online, in-game, you are who you want to be, or how you present yourself. And you may have different avatars in the same game. You may have one that's an elf, and one that's an orc, or one that's a unicorn. Depends on the game, I suppose. Or you could talk about my main is a mage, or my main is a tank, or my main is a, whatever. So everyone is accepted how they want to present themselves. And in this day and age, that's something that's really
smart,
great, really nice. And I'm all for that. I'm all for inclusiveness.
Yeah. And I guess that would also serve a new author as well. You are who you present yourself to be. So in all the world of struggling to find your voice, who cares what I think, who would read my words? Words matter. Yes. You are who you present yourself to be, right?
I'd never thought of that. That's very interesting. I mean, life of decades, 4 decades or more of writing as a living. I am a new author. And what I've learned since being published, first of all, I was lucky enough to have a good literary agent, which really helps. And we had quite a while before we went to market, because, I'll get onto that in a moment. But you learn that this is there's a completely different step between being published or getting your book in print and anyone noticing. There used to be 500,000 books published a year. Now there are 5 million, because so many are self-published. I'm sure they're all brilliant, but even if they are all brilliant, there's not time to read them all. There are very few reviewers and literary pages left, and they are more likely to notice someone who's already been published, or perhaps was a TV star and has written a book that has a name. But for those of us who are coming to this for the first time, it's difficult to get notice. And I've talked to other writers about this. But that's part of the job, is you have to go out and find the audience and make waves and let them know that your work is out there, and if they want to check it out. I mean, that's why we give free samples away on my website. You can get a free chapter of me reading it, an audio chapter, or download a free chapter from the book. I deliberately chose 2 chapters that are quite amusing as well as being adventurous. So hope people like them, and then might want to buy the other 35 chapters or however many and take a look at the book. Because, if you go into a bookstore, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
The amount of books. I go in there and I'm not particularly adventurous, often sort of going through shuffling through the aisles and thinking what and this, and then picking up something safe and going home thinking, that's not very adventurous. Come on, what about try? And then, of course, the thing that really, really sells any book is word of mouth. And you say to a friend, have you read any good books lately? And they say, oh, yeah, you've got to read this, you've got to read that. My daughter is mad keen on fantasy. And I don't think I'd have written this book if she hadn't turned me on to some of the things she's reading. Because I just sort of drifted away from fantasy. And she turned me on to a couple of books, including, by the way, the Game of Thrones series. I was in Las Vegas. I was playing in the World Series of Poker. I wrote a couple of books about the poker boom. And I managed to win a seat to play in the main event. So I said to my daughter, look, if I survive the first day, that I got my days off, what should I read? And she said, get a Game of Thrones. And this was before the series on the TV. So I went to Barnes & Noble in Vegas, and I bought the 4-volume set. I thought, well, if Lizzie says it's good, it's good. And on my days off, I sat there and just devoured them. This is just... he's such a good writer. Yeah. I love them, and various other books. And so I just came back to kind of a first love of mine, which is fantasy stories. The first great work in English is a fantasy story, Beowulf. It's got a dragon, it's got a hoard of treasure, it's got a monster, it's got a monster's mother. And then all the other things like the Grimm's fairy tales and the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Fairy Queen, the Arabian Nights, fantasy tales, wonder tales, all of them. And they're really particularly good. They work because they make sense of the world. Life doesn't make sense, stories do. Anyway, it's been just great to come back to this art form that I love. And I've always thought that the highest form of writing is narrative. I love writing dialogue, and there's a lot of dialogue in my books, but writing a narrative where you're telling the story and showing it in scenes that you bring alive, to me, is the highest form of writing, because it's just you and the reader, or just you and the listener. Whereas television and film is a director's medium, stage is an actor's medium, opera is a singer's medium, like a musician's medium. But no, books is your authorial voice. And nobody else could have written these books.
Right.
Unpublished books that I wrote 20 or 30 years ago that I tried that weren't good enough to be published. Thank God they weren't. Anyone could have written them. I'm sure if I look back at them, I'd think, oh my Lord. but New Rock, New Roll is my voice. And it's just a pleasure to have found it at last.
I love it. So, Richard, I have one more question to ask you as we end our time together. You've been gracious with your time. I think I could talk to you all week and just keep learning. You have so many, I'm going to have to listen to this many times because you have so many little things that you've said that I'm like, I need that. I need that on my wall. That's just like, there's so many great messages you've shared. But before,
thank you. I didn't even get around to my Douglas Adams story, so we'll do that. And then when the sequel is published, which I think is in November, we'll come back and we'll do those ones.
I will definitely hold a space for you anytime, Richard. Before I ask you my last question, though, as far as the website you mentioned, we can get copies of hear a version of the book. We can download some copies of it. Where can we go to connect with you? Where are you most active? And then after that, I have one more question to end off our conversation.
Yeah, it's www.richardsparks.com. There's no E in Sparks. That's the website. It's entirely devoted to the books now. We've also got just started, I think last week, at Instagram, TikTok. My assistant started a TikTok account called @NewRockNewRoll, ROLE, and she went out on the streets with a cosplay actor dressed as an orc, like one of the lead three characters from the book, because this guy came to the book launch party in London and was great. He never broke character all through the party. It was very funny and sweet. And so there's these daft little video clips she's made of this orc landing in London, looking completely surprised and talking to people, saying, "Mate, where am I? What's going on here?" And eventually goes into a shop, which is in the West End of London, called the Orc's Nest. You go, "Oh, finally," which is a fantasy game-playing bookstore. And it's sweet, these tiny little clips on New Rock, New Roll at TikTok.
Yeah.
And she sent me the link this morning. She said, it's already had 2,000 views. I mean, that's the world these days.
Right.
So good for her. I have to give her a raise one of these days. So yeah, just go to richardsparks.com or Google @NewRockNewRoll, and I think there's Instagram and stuff. But it's early days yet. We're starting out, but please get a free sample.
I love it. Okay, Richard, my last question for you around the title of my podcast is Living the Next Chapter. I'm curious. You're writing, continue to write. What's next for you? How are you living your next chapter as a writer?
This is it. This is my next chapter. It started less than 5 years ago. Yeah. I've gone from any other form of... I'm turning down all other work, although I've got a TV thing that's kind of risen from the grave that I will be involved with when that happens, if. But no, this is it. This is my bliss. And I wish I could take my own advice and listen to myself sometimes, because I simply don't know what's going on in book 5. Yeah. Just as I didn't know in book 4 or book 3 or book 2, in the first book, until you stood off and cracked it and goes, that's illogical. That can't. Well, of course, if this happens, then you go and set this up. And all the structural work you're doing, as well as the fun of just writing your 500 words a day and just keeping on. I just want to find out what happens next to my characters.
Yeah. Well,
so I'm very lucky to have found this. I really am.
You are a brilliant person to speak with, Richard. I feel like I've learned so much just having time with you. I feel like I've had like a little mini masterclass with you, and just your insight is amazing. So,
well, that's very kind of you to say so. I'm happy to pass on anything I've learned from. I've had some great mentors, so if I'm able to spark something in anyone who's listening or in yourself, I'm just thrilled to have been able to do that.
It's great. And for all those listening, remember that words matter, and put yourself out there. Build your parachute as you jump. All those great things that we chatted about. Richard, thank you so much for being part of Living the Next Chapter.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Everyone, all the information, as always, is in the show notes. Make sure you go over, and if you're a TikTok follower like I am, go over and check out Richard's TikTok as well, and make sure you share that so everyone can see the amazing work and all the amazing stuff going on as well. Again, Richard, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening all the way to the end of the podcast. That's a big signal to all of the players, the YouTubes, the Apples, the Spotifys, that you found value in this episode of Living the Next Chapter. Just by you listening to the end. You just sent a huge bat signal out to the app saying this was a great podcast, a great conversation. So you listening to this point, you've done your job. I have one more ask of you. If you know anyone that would benefit from this conversation, would you share this episode with them? Would you just get on, send them a message, send them the episode, tell them about this episode, tell them to go livinginthenextchapter.com to get all the information about the podcast. Can you do that for me? Because the more people that hear this message, this episode, the better. I want to support these amazing authors. And I know you do as well. So sharing this episode really helps. And I appreciate you. See you on the next episode. And thank you for listening to Living the Next Chapter.